So can you go into your expound a little bit on what woke anti-Semitism is and why is it distinct from, the non-woke anti-Semitism?
Sure. So woke anti-Semitism to me is it's a relatively recent variant of anti-Semitism that sort of emerges out of woke discourse. Woke discourse provides almost a perfect permission structure for a very particular kind of anti-Semitism. When you link identity to privilege in a very fixed way, like white privilege that we see in today's discourse, it's only a half step away to then link Jewish identity to privilege. So the term Jewish privilege, the hashtag, trended on Twitter for a couple of days straight. And we've seen examples of that. There's one great example at Stanford. There was a Stanford student senator that was being sort of brought up on charges for suggesting that it was okay to say that Jews control the media or banking, and that was correct. And he was sort of in the cross-examination of him, several students who were denouncing him said that we have to, though, examine the intersection between Jewish privilege and white privilege. And I thought that was interesting because it wasn't okay to express anti-Semitism in the traditional vernacular of Jews control the world, but it was okay somehow if you smuggled it in through this sort of social justice discourse. And I think that's what we're starting to see happen. There were other examples of that. The concept of equity, that Ibram X. Kendi has articulated, that any group that is sort of on average below the mean must be discriminated against. That's a perfect prescription for anti-Jewish and anti-Asian sentiment, frankly. If any group below the mean on average is being discriminated against, any group above the mean is part of the problem, is complicit in white supremacy, is therefore doing the discriminating. And we see that a lot. But I think the larger point that I want to make about woke anti-Semitism is that it contributes in a liberal society. Anytime you have a dogma, you establish a dogma, you're going to see ever more extreme forms of that dogma. Dogma begets ever more extreme forms of dogma. And that's not good for the Jews, as we like to say. Jews thrive in liberal societies, open societies, where they're able to bring Jewish culture in a very open way, where we're able to debate ideas. One of the most frustrating things about the current intellectual environment is I was brought up around a lot of Jews, and we debated all the time. We debated everything. I learned by debating. And I find it very difficult to be shut down and be told that someone has the truth already about an important topic and that I should just sit down and shut up. And I think, in a way, in addition to it being ultimately, a vector for anti-Semitism, it also shuts down a key aspect of who I am as a Jewish person too. I mean, Jews play a role in society. It's that aversive persona that challenges the status quo. That aspect of who we are is also being shut down in the current intellectual environment.
It strikes me as interesting, David, the consequences of what, I guess we'll call critical social justice, is that for the longest time, Jews have, they weren't seen as white, right? By the very people who view white as a moral good. So, that's why, Hitler did what he did. White was good and Jews were not. And so they were, exterminated that way. And now what we're seeing is that whiteness is seen as evil. And so now Jews are painted as part of white adjacent, or as part of, having a lot of privilege. And so they're attacked from this other end for actually being hyper white. I think Pamela Paresky wrote a great piece, I think it was in the Jewish Journal, about this concept of hyper whiteness, because it's like combining all sorts of privilege, as if the Jews and the privilege make the scale sit right on top, and therefore are beneficiaries of hyper whiteness in a world where whiteness is seen as an unmitigated evil. And so there's this weird contradiction, right? And so, I mean, this is where it seems particularly pernicious, because it's adding this dimension of attack.
Right. Look, Jews are sometimes seen as the capitalist by Marxists, and they're seen as Marxists by capitalists. And so so depending on what the moral good is, as Pamela, I thought, eloquently put it in that article, we can be associated with its opposite. Jews are always overrepresented in most institutions and most intellectual debates. And so, as you said, if whiteness is associated with a moral good, then Jews are not white. And if it's associated with a moral flaw, then Jews are white. And so that to me is disturbing. I also think, and Andrew Sullivan wrote about this, that demonizing whiteness the way that this discourse does is only a half step away from demonizing Jews. If you actually listen to the rhetoric of demonizing whiteness, it sounds, if you just substituted the word Jew for white, it sounds a lot like the most, hideous anti-Semitic rhetoric. And so I don't like a discourse that demonizes people, period, in that way, based on some identity characteristics. I think it provides permission structure for all kinds of wrongs. And I think we should push back against that because it demonizes white people, not because it's anti-Semitic or will lead to anti-Semitism, but it does do that. It does condition people to speak out against people who are perceived as powerful or successful.